So when you decided to start the Grand Canyon business, that's when John Jr. came on the scene. That's when John Jr. You said last night you were working for the Bureau.
Mm-hmm.
And so how did you enter the scene here?
Well, I got my I got my start on the rivers quite a bit earlier than that, when Dad was still working with the Boy Scouts. I kept waiting for the time when I turned 14 so I could go on a river trip with him, and the regulations were that unless you were 14 you couldn't go down on the Explorer river trips. He snuck me in on a little bit ahead of time on my 13th. So I did take 4 or 5 trips down the Glen Canyon from in my teenage years.
Let me say that you already had his birthday cake baked ready for him.
So I got a little bit of a head start in the Glen Canyon, and then again, like I mentioned, when I got out of high school, I went to work on the Glen Canyon Dam for a couple of years. Dad came down on a river trip just after he had started the commercial business and asked me to be a part of it, and I decided to go ahead and do it. And we continued running trips on the Glen Canyon until the lake backed up to the point where it wasn't really feasible to do a river trip there anymore. By then, river running was getting to be real popular, and we branched out all over the West, running rivers, trips on the Green River and up on the Yampa River, down Cataract Canyon, got up into Idaho on some of the rivers up there. And as we started to talk yesterday, our first trip, we wanted to get down here in the Grand Canyon, but the first opportunity came with beginning to outfit for the BYU's geological department. We were involved with them, I guess, for about 4 or 5 years, and took 1 or 2 trips a year for them in, different areas of the canyon. They were primarily interested in the lava flows down in the bottom part. Got a frog in my throat this morning.
You want to swig
I got a little bit of coffee here. I guess we pretty much had the same growth as all of the rest of the outfitters who started down here about that period of time. Some of the earliest commercial outfitters were Hatch, and Georgie White had been operating down here for a few years. Western River Expeditions and Grand Canyon Expeditions and us, we all started pretty much within a few years of each other. And I think all of our experience down here in the Grand Canyon was just, we were riding a snowball or an avalanche. It was just so popular, it just got more and more and more and more popular.
Why was that, do you think? What kicked all that off?
Well, one thing that kicked it off, everybody was probably in the same boat as far as having limited funding for promotion and advertising. Everybody tried to figure out the very best ways they could do it. And when the Kennedys decided to come down here and become river runners, I think they came down, they were with Hatches. I think as I remember, they went down the Yampa and the Green River, and then they came down here, and then they went up on the Salmon River after that. But they got so much media attention when they came down the Grand Canyon here that seemed to really kick the snowball off, as I remember. I mean, they weren't the only reason, but it helped a lot. Got a lot of free publicity out of that. Everybody benefited from it.
Do you remember what year that was?
Probably 64, 65 maybe. Somewhere in the mid-60s.
So they came down, and there was a lot of like Time Magazine and TV and all that stuff.
Yeah, there were helicopters hovering all over and all sorts of news coverage, and so it just got the word out there for a long time, and a lot of folks just saw it and wanted to be a part of it and wanted to see what was going on down here. And then too, I think at least half of the people that have come through the canyon have just been word of mouth advertising passed on. You know, one of their friends had a great time, and so they wanted to come and do it. And
You know, what John has just said is important and significant, and I'd like to just add one thought to it, and that is that when we published advertising in magazines and newspapers and sources of that type, we never did receive more than a 2%. That was the most we ever got, return on our ads. And so we worked up the theory in our own organization that if you give people a good trip and a good experience and at a price they can afford, and treat them like human beings and don't treat one of them better than the other one, you're going to get some responses. And that's what happened. Our success, all of our successes, we either created within a planned advertising directed to certain people or organizations, or it was word of mouth from people who were satisfied telling people who would like to be satisfied in such an adventure. And that's the fault of the boys and the girls on the river who were taking care of them where the action was.
What kind of boats did you start out with down here?
our first trip through was with two 27-foot pontoons, and they were rigged with the old over the rear end motor mount and rowing frames. In the early days, it was pretty much the custom to power down through the slower sections and some of the bigger rapids, and then rapids like Hance and Lava Falls, we always pulled the motors up and let the people walk, and then double rowed down through the left-hand side in both cases. I guess after a little while, somebody decided that that was a little bit too much work and started attempting to run down through different routes through the rapids. And as soon as one or two of the outfitters saw that they could do that, then it pretty much snowballed to everybody else. And the old rowing of the big boats through those major rapids was a thing of the past.
Well, how was that? Did you guys crash and burn a lot? That sounds like a pretty heroic kind of endeavor to even...
Well, we were real lucky. My personal experience was in that rowing respect was with Hatches. I met him on my first trip met Ted Hatch down at Lava Falls on my first trip through the canyon. And we talked a little bit, and he told me, he says, if you got any free time, he says, I'd like to hire you as a guide because, you know, we're getting real busy. So I got a little bit of experience in the early years with Hatches. When we weren't busy with our operation, I'd slip in a trip here and there, and I guess over about a 2-year period, I ran 8 or 9 trips for Ted. But I learned quite a bit about the river and about the lure down here, and picked up some of their skills and habits as far as running, and then gradually evolved out of that into our own style, I guess. But
was that Ted himself that you were learning from, or were there?
Well, there's
other
a combination. I feel pretty lucky to have been down here at the time because most of the trips that I ran on the canyon were Shorty Burton and myself in one way or another. And of course, he died down here in the canyon later on, but Ted was a part of those early trips quite often, but I was always with Shorty. He and I were together on just about every trip that I made down here. And there was 2 or 3 other guides who were along also.
What was Shorty like?
He was a good old boy. I mean, he was a lot like Kent Frost is. He just did his job. He didn't get in anybody's face. He was an excellent outdoorsman. I think he was one of the better outdoor cooks that I've seen in the early days. And he took me under his wing and taught me a lot about Dutch oven cooking and this, that, and the other. I really learned quite a bit from him. He was just a real laid-back, nice guy.
And I know. And could you tell us a little bit about how he died down here?
Well, I wasn't on the trip. By the time his accident took place, we were so busy in what we were doing that I just didn't get a chance to participate with any of the other outfitters anymore. But Shorty got into a problem in Upset Rapid, and I guess nobody but him will know exactly what happened, but he had a motor failure from what I understand and drifted into the big hole sideways, and it rolled the boat over. In those days, I don't believe they were using, Hatch wasn't using outriggers at that time, so it was just a single pontoon. And anyway, Shorty went over. Everybody in the boat got tossed out. There were several other boats on the party, and they fished all of the rest of the people out and got a hold of the boat, pulled it over to shore. Nobody saw Shorty, and they just assumed that in the confusion and everything that he'd drifted downstream and they'd pick him up. As they got the boat over to shore and righted it, here is Shorty trapped in the motor frame. Apparently one of the eye bolts or something had grabbed the back of his life jacket and had kept him down. They don't know whether he was knocked unconscious as the boat went over and just happened to get trapped in there, or if the thing actually hooked his jacket and he couldn't get loose. You know, that's just something that's nobody knows for sure, but it was a great loss. I know at the time I was in National Guard camp when I heard the news report come over the radio, and it was a pretty big loss. Everybody on the river knew Shorty and really appreciated him and respected him. You know, he was just loved by everybody, I believe, everybody that knew him.
I wonder if that boat, those boats, did they still, that was an outside rig with a transom hanging off the back?
Yeah, that was the standard old-time over the rear end motor mount.
And did they probably still had floors in them and everything? Was that?
Yeah, they would have had floors in them. It's kind of hard to tell when, you know, in the evolution of boatcraft down here and design, when all of that took place with the floors coming out. They usually didn't start pulling floors out of them until they had an inside basket type frame arrangement. In the early days, the floor, the equipment was supported on a plywood floor that was suspended by chains above the rubber floor on the boat. But they were pretty easily torn out. Once you got one torn, you couldn't proceed because it gave you two big rudders hanging underneath the boat. Couldn't maneuver very well. So as the boats got older and got beat up a little bit more and more, they just the floors became weaker, and I think everybody about the same time decided, let's get rid of these things and eliminate a problem. So they redesigned equipment so that it would take care of that.
Did you guys have floors in your early boats?
Initially we did. You know, we had the same type rigs, and our evolution pretty much follows what I just said. You know, it just got to a point where we decided that that wasn't the best way to do things anymore, and started moving towards more inner frames like what we use now, only they were made of tubular steel and plywood rather than the rolled aluminum.
Yeah, we gotta just change the battery. Are you guys doing okay?
Yeah.
You hanging in here?
We had to coordinate with him, and all our sweeps had to be together and coordinated, but interestingly enough, they were using 14-foot sweeps. Now you stop and think about that. You're sitting there from the tip of one oar to the tip of the other oar is about 29 to 30 feet. That's a big
Yeah.
sweep.
Well, did you guys, how are we doing there? Okay. Did you guys, how'd you guys,
Thank you.
when you first came down here, were you scared? Like getting through, was it a...
Heck yes. You know, and I'm not saying this in any kind of heroic fashion, but I didn't have the luxury of ever running. The only river that only trip I ever made where I had a guide was down the Glen Canyon one, and I went down with my dad. And every other river that I went down, or first time, it was me and Les Jones. And I say Les Jones wasn't there personally, but he put out a pretty good quality scroll map. of the various river trips that were being taken in the western United States. And I remember my first trip through the Grand Canyon. I was pretty concerned because it was a big guy, and I had never been down here. I'd run cataract a couple of times before, and so I got with Les and bought one of his maps and poked his brain a little bit for information and made some notes. And I ran into one of Hatch's early guides. His name was Sylvester Allen from Springville, and sat around his kitchen table for an evening or two, picking his brain and writing notes down about what to watch out for and what to do down here. So with a combination of Les's maps and a little bit experience that I'd gained on other rivers and some of the information that I picked up from some of the other guides, we come on down. And luckily or whatever, we made the trips just fine and didn't have any major problems. But all of my trips on Cataract and down here and up on the Middle Fork and the main salmon, they were all done first-time runs, without a guide, without an experienced guide with. But it was just a necessity because we didn't have the wherewithal to, or other guides weren't available at the time that we were going.
Now, so what did Les do there?
Well, I used to kid him that it was he and I on all of the trips that I made, but he wasn't there in person, but his map was there to help me get through.
Did he have maps on all the rivers or just the canyon?
He had maps on just about all of the major rivers that in the western United States at that time.
I wonder, was he selling them? I wonder how come he did that.
Yeah.
He was selling them. Yeah, he'd take a geological survey map. Those maps, of course, were available. But when you ended up with enough maps to cover a river section, you had a pretty good stack of maps, and it was bulky, and they'd usually get torn up and as you used them. So Les just cut a corridor out that represented the river and a short distance to either side of it, and then kind of fastened them all together and ran it through some sort of a blueprint machine. Some of his early ones were kind of primitive, and they didn't last too awful long out in the sun and the weather, but they still had the good information on. And then he'd made several runs down here by himself in the 50s, and he put a lot of his own comments and outlined where the obstacles were in the major rapids and suggested routes through. Of course, you used that. You took his information and anybody else's and stopped and looked at the rapid and choose which way you wanted to go through. And
I'd like to say one thing, if I may, in relationship to John here, and that is not because he's my son do I say this. I'm happy that he is. And that's the first time you ever heard me say I'm happy. John, in my estimation, from all of the river guides that I have known, exhibits more inborn feeling and understanding for picking the routes or the course through a rapid. I don't know of him anywhere where we've been, but it hasn't been a practice in the larger runs to check the rapid before he enters it. He knows exactly where he's going. He knows exactly where something could go wrong, if it does go wrong. And he has a plan in mind before he gets back in the boat. If I get into that spot, how can I get out? Or what am I going to have to do? And that has been, as I've witnessed and participated with him, that has been one of his best traits and characteristics, to have that kind of an inborn ability to know what to do and how to do it and to see that it's done. And as a consequence, in all of his years of running, has never upset anything anywhere that I know of, unless it was me.
Yeah. Thanks for the compliment.
I guess we better get in. God, there's all this stuff we need to get in, but I guess we better hear about Crystal.
Crystal. Well, I wish I could say that it was a big accomplishment like being the first to conquer Mount Everest after a whole bunch of other people had tried it, but I just happened to be the leader of the first group through the canyon after the flood, and it was a pretty exciting trip. There was a lot of nervousness and everything starting out because we had word from the Park Service that a helicopter pilot had been flying through the canyon after the flood in 1966, and there were some considerable changes down here. One at Bright Angel and another down here at Crystal, where the rapid, in his words, was 10 times worse than Lava Falls and totally unrunnable. Well, that got the Park Service all nervous and upset. And so they contacted us and, as I said, the Western River Guides Association, and I just happened to be the first one down the canyon. So I was asked to check out all of the drainages on the north side of the river coming down. I wasn't looking for any particular debris flows or anything else unless they affected the river. You know, if they changed rapids, then I was looking for them. I didn't see any real changes until we got down to Bright Angel, and of course that countryside was all disrupted and torn up from the flood there because the drainages of Bright Angel and Crystal Creek were right together. Crystal also flooded pretty bad. I think we had a lot of bravado in the upper part of the canyon coming down about, you know, this wasn't going to deter us any, but the closer we got down here, the more butterflies started to appear. And as we got down to Boucher Rapid, we noticed that the lake was, the river was kind of dammed up in a lake effect here. It was obvious that there had been a pretty good impound of water back here because there was big mud stains on the wall, and all of the vegetation was coated with flood debris, frothy mud and leaves and limbs and this sort of thing. So we came around the corner. I had two 33-foot pontoons tied side by side, and again we were working on one of these geology trips with BYU. We were caching some pretty big amount of equipment down in the lower canyon for them to use on some field trips, or field studies rather. So I had two 33s tied side by side with a mountain of equipment on it. But as we come around the corner there, some of the people in the front of the boat said, "Hey, we can hear a lot of noise down here, even over the motor." So I shut the motor down, and sure enough, we could hear a pretty good rumbling down here. Prior to that time, Crystal was just a tiny little rapid that really didn't slow anybody down. It was, I think we worried more about dinging a prop going through it because it was real wide and shallow. But anyhow, it was roaring now, and so we pulled in down below here and climbed this hill to take a look at it, and it was quite a sight. The floodplain in the bottom of the canyon here was just totally barren. There was no green vegetation down there. It was all just a big jumble of rocks. Crystal Creek was gently flowing down the bottom of it like it always had been, and but there was a major rapid out there now. I kind of picked the way that I thought I ought to go in the first 5 minutes I was up here on the hill looking at it, but I wanted to look at it closer, so we hiked down through the bottom of the canyon to the edge of the river and checked it out from all different angles. And I remember crossing the big boulder patch down here. The rocks were still so unstable that some of these big rocks that were the size of a Volkswagen or so would be teetering and tipping. And I do remember that we wouldn't let passengers walk down, you know, to photograph the rapid or anything because of those teetering rocks. A couple of them rolled over, and we never did have anybody injured, but it could have been a bad situation. After spending about an hour looking things over, came back up and got everybody aboard, and went ahead and took off and ran the rapid pretty much down the left-hand side, and had no problems. Splashed water all over, but the rapid in those days was a lot different than it is now, and I think that, of course, I think the rapid right now is a lot more difficult to run than it was in those days. There was a lot of real big waves from the entrance right on down through the main channel and down the left-hand side. I think there was in my memory was the start of the big hole that was down below Slate Canyon on the left, but it hadn't really established itself into a major hole. It was just a lot of hermit-type waves going down through there. At the bottom end of the debris delta, there was the current split into a Y, and right at the center of the Y was a great big rock pile. And of course, it's been there, and now it's moved further downstream from the effects of the high water in '83 and '84. In my memory and recollection, over the few years from after the flood formed crystal, the rock shifted around a little bit and settled in, eroded out. And it changed a little bit here and there, but remained pretty much constant. A big hole developed down there below Slate Canyon on the left, which gave everybody fits that, got into that area. But
well, was that hole there that day that you first saw it?
It was probably there, but it wasn't as sharp and defined as it became later. Now, I've heard stories that a big boulder washed out of Slate Canyon and formed that, but I don't recall exactly when that would have happened. I just know that first trip through there, maybe it was the water stage or whatever, but the waves were just big waves, and there wasn't anything that was really in the way of a hole, wasn't very sharp. The big obstacle was the rock bar that was out in the center. For quite a few years there, we were taking big groups of college students on geology trips through the canyon, and with a boat that heavy, we had 2 pontoons tied side by side for those. And with that big of a boat, we chose a course down the left-hand side just because of the momentum of the boat. We didn't figure we could make a cut around the right side, but with single boats, we generally ran around the right side, skirted the waves up on the top and skirted the hole as much as we could, and then took the channel around the right-hand side of the rock bar. I've had the opportunity to run the river twice since the high water in '83 and '84, but in both of those occasions, the river was up pretty high itself in the mid to upper 20,000 foot range, and a lot of the rock bar that had been washed downstream, which is evidence now, was not really that apparent to me. And when I came up here and looked at this last night, I was pretty surprised to see the extent of the rock bars that had been pushed on downstream, pretty well blocking the middle of the river on down below or in the tail of the rapid.
Do you remember what the water was there in '66?
I think we were running probably at 10 or 12,000 feet.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
And even then, that hole hadn't taken shape?
No, not to the extent that it did later on. And I don't know, maybe that was just that I didn't remember it, but it just, I ran right down through it and didn't get hit very bad with anything.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that there was something pretty evident for about half a mile to 3/4 of a mile upstream. The river was almost a dead lake. There was hardly any current at all, so there was some obvious damming here at the head of it, even that late, or that long after the flood.
In general, like when you were running back there in the mid-'60s, what was the corridor like down here? What were the beaches like? What was the canyon like? And how is that different from what you're seeing today?
Well, of course, those were just a few years after they had shut off the Glen Canyon Dam, and we no longer got any heavy silt, runoff, spring runoff and floods. So I think that there was plenty of beaches in those years. I would say that the beaches lasted pretty good for about 10 years, but they just gradually kept eroding away with high water flows that occasionally took place in the canyon, and I think the wind had a lot to do with removing some of the beaches. What I saw over the years was just a gradual decline in the size of the beaches, and it's pretty much constant all the way through the canyon. Some of the bigger beaches that we used to camp on are more dramatic in their loss now, like Tapeats Creek. It seemed like there was solid sand from the base of Tapeats Creek clear down to the next corner, about a quarter of a mile, and now there's virtually no sand in there. It's hard to say exactly what caused it. That's what you scientists are trying to determine now, but we definitely did see a decline in the size of beaches, which that combined with the tremendous number or growth of river trips down through here has required use of a lot of smaller bars and stuff that normally weren't used in those days for campsites. Some of the big old-time campsites are not used anymore because there's nothing there to camp on.
What else? Vegetation, stuff like that. Cleanliness. Do you see a change there in those areas?
In the early years, it was pretty much the policy of just about any outdoorsman, not just river runners, but hunters and campers and hikers. With their garbage, they'd burn the burnable stuff and burn tin cans to get the tin off of them and the food particles, and then they were either buried or, in the case of the river here, a lot of stuff was tossed in the river. And I think just about everybody that was running down here did that. I mean, it was just the accepted way to dispose of things. With the advent of a lot of aluminum and plastics and glass, of course, that stuff doesn't erode away and rust away like the others, but that was a practice that pretty much stopped real quick. As more and more people came down here, it was obvious that we couldn't bury things anymore because they'd be buried one week and the next week they'd be uncovered. In the early days, the Western River Guides Association sponsored a cleanup trip down here where all of the outfitters that cared to participate, and I think all of them did, provided a boat and a crew. We divided up the canyon into sections and then drew numbers out of a hat to see who cleaned up what section, and then we just took off on a trip and moved through the canyon, picked up charcoal from fires, toilet paper, any tin cans or debris or anything that we found, and we really scoured the canyon. And I think that cleanup trip has taken place numerous times since then, but I'd say in the last 25 years probably there has been a real concerted effort by all of the guides and outfitters to really keep the canyon clean, and it's pretty impressive. I mean, you don't go any place where things are kept cleaner and are cleaner than they are down here. It's a real testament to the concern that everybody down here has got.
Well, heck, I get Jeff.
I'd just like to make one comment, about having been the first one to be through run Crystal. Like I said a little earlier, I don't consider that to be any big heroic feat, because shortly after that, I just happened to be the first one that did it, and after that same year, hundreds of other guides and parties went through here and did the same thing. So there's a lot of guys that were running the river then that were just as qualified as I was. I just happened to be the first one through, and I appreciate my 15 minutes of glory, but anybody could have done it that was there probably.
Well, having worked for the Bureau there in '61, what do you think the Bureau has changed? What do you think about this trip, the idea of bringing down everybody to try and scope out the changes and figure out how to run the dam and all that?
I think it's a good idea, and I think it's, the studies and everything that have been taking place for the last 10 years would have been good to have at least been going on to some degree right from the start, so that there could have been a little more management taking place earlier. I have been involved a couple of times through marine contracting work with various bureau operations in the years between, and I think most everybody has a concern about the canyon and a concern about preserving things down here, but there have been a few people that we've talked to. I'm not naming any names or anything, and I'm not condemning the Bureau in any way, but some personal feelings of some of the folks is to heck with the canyon, the generating power and everything else is the most important thing to them. But I'm happy to see the public awareness, to try and preserve this canyon and not let it, just follow the natural, well, not natural course, but the course of ungoverned water running through here and everything. I think the stabilization of the water flows is really going to help.
Jeff, can you think? Boy, that was a big light hit, wasn't it?
Yeah, we've had some problems.
Can you think of anything?
I always like for them to talk about how, their feelings about this trip. That seems like something that you could cover.
Yeah, just what's it like to be here with all these other legends?
Well, I'll tell you, just feel the same way as everybody else does. In my personal case, I wonder how come I was invited to come along. I think there's a lot of qualified people out there that give information, but I'm just really happy to have been invited, and I'm real happy to have been invited along with my dad and taking another trip down the river with him and reminiscing about the old times. And of course, all the other folks that are on this trip, it's just a dream come true, really. A lot of these folks are people that I talked about to my people on the river, telling about the early pioneers here. I never thought in a million years I'd ever meet them, let alone be able to participate in a trip like this. It's just great, and I think the scientific investigation here is just great too. I hope that I'm able to contribute something to it.
Outstanding. Sir?
We gotta go.
Well, I'm thinking, I'm getting that vibration. God, I think we're gonna have to, I'm gonna have to try to sit down with you guys again. I can, what I'm feeling on this trip about talking to everybody is that the little amount of time that we're getting is nowhere near enough time to cover all the things I'd like to go into. Gosh, I want to hear about just, the early boatmen and that trip that you were talking about on the Grijalva, and what's Jack Curry like, and there's all these questions that I have in my mind.
Yeah.
Who were those early guys on the scene and stuff like that. Maybe we can round you up.
Anytime you want to talk some more.
Are you guys
up for it?
Where are you living now? Are you up in Orem or
I live about 20 miles north of Orem.
And I'm in Orem.
Well, I'm gonna have to swing by there.
You have another advantage if that was possible. We keep having things brought up or they come to mind unexpectedly that if we were at home, we can pull the drawer and pull the file and we've got the answer.
Yeah.
And there is so much of that we have on file.
Yeah.
And coming down here, while we were given some general instructions and information that was extremely helpful, at the same time, they didn't, to me personally, open the windows of what was trying to be accomplished, what really would have been the best stuff to have brought down. And we have motion pictures from all of our adventures and whatnot in our files and things like that. But I didn't know whether it would be worth hauling a big 16 millimeter film down here, to get one little glimpse of something, and still that one little glimpse may have been a key that was more important than anything else. But having that stuff available in a set place is...
Well, I'm feeling that with everybody, just that the hour or two that we get to spend is not near enough time to even get into it. I guess we better rumble here.